each and every one of you present today, that's the seventh year medical students, to ask yourself one main question. Ask yourself, what do I expect out of my thesis? Or, in other words, what will be a satisfactory outcome for me at the end of this final year? I think this question is very important because based on the answer that you will give to this question is going to determine not only the drive with which you're going to approach your thesis, but the kind of topic and the way you're going to go about your research topic. So it's very important. Over the years, when we ask this question, a few answers always pop up. Some give a very popular one, which is they just want to graduate. That is all they need is to get out of the medical school and be a doctor. That is fine. That is an objective out of a thesis. For some people, it is about having a high mark. That is, they have senior students who have graduated with 85, 90%, 95%, and they tell themselves, I would like to have such a mark too. That is an objective for somebody. Another person could be actually have the objective to acquire new skills and basic knowledge in research methodology for future career use. Some actually get into this thesis with that objective. Now, for other people, they get into the thesis with the aim of having the opportunity to publish their first article or to publish their first research article. That is another objective. Now, there is one objective which is a little bit rare or an outcome that some people mention, which is a little bit rare, but sometimes mentioned, which is I've had a few students tell me they are getting into research with the aim of solving a particular pertinent issue they identified either in hospital or in their community. I mean, it's very ballsy, it's very bold, but that could be somebody's main aim throughout at the end of his medical thesis. Now, what I want to let you all know is that all of these outcomes are not mutually exclusive, which means that you could do a thesis which permits you to achieve all of these aforementioned outcomes. It doesn't mean you must focus just on one of them. No. If you aim to actually have a good mark, graduate from medical school, publish your thesis, get basic research skills, it's possible to acquire all of these through your medical thesis. So, having said that, I think we could go directly into the deep of our topic. So, as you see, I've tried as much as possible to gather these steps into 10 minute steps. That is right from the choice of a research topic right down to the public defense of your thesis. And we're going to be looking at one step after another, during which I'll be giving very brief and summarized notions about what the step comprises, and a few tips along the way to help you go through these steps successfully. So the first step will be, of course, the choice of a research topic. Now, what you should know is that the choice of a research topic is done at various moments. Some people actually choose their topic right before the seventh year. I've had students who right from the fifth year already know what they're going to work on and even start working on something concerning that thesis right from the fifth year or even the sixth year. But for the vast majority, you're going to choose your topic in the first month of your final year, that is the seventh year. Now, there are several ways with which one comes up with the topic. One of them is actually through experiences during your posting, either in the hospital or during your integrated medicine posting. I just want to give a practical example here. About 3 years ago, I received about two sixth-year medical students in my hospital for their sixth-year integrated medicine. And during their stay there, one actually brought to my attention that he noticed that the number of pregnant women who come for ANC and are positive for hepatitis B is quite very high. And I tried to survey over a few weeks, and I actually realized that what he was saying was quite true. So now, when you have such an observation, you can ask yourself a question, but is it that in this community we actually have a very high prevalence of this hepatitis B amongst pregnant women? Or is it just a coincidence that all the women who come to the hospital are mostly those who are hepatitis B positive? From there, there's a problem. There's a question without an answer. Is the prevalence really that high in that community or not? This now can lead to a research topic which could be to determine the prevalence of hepatitis B amongst pregnant women in the Bafman Health area, for example. And to add more flesh to that, actually, a study was actually done on that, which is currently in the phase of editing for publication, thanks to this observation from the student. Now, your thesis idea could also come from your observations in the community. I remember last year there is this student who met me and she told me she has noticed that many girls nowadays use topical steroids, what the French usually call Felin Johnson. And she was like, she wants to understand why so many young women get into that nowadays. She doesn't know why, and she thinks it can be exciting and interesting to try to get the reasons why or the reasons that push women towards this practice. And of course, this could lead to a research topic. Now, the design now depending whether quantitative or qualitative. At the end of the day, you could actually design a research study with the aim of trying to identify the reasons that push women to this practice of using topical steroids. That is one way of getting your research topic. Now, a very easy way is from the recommendations from previous studies. At the end of a study, generally you draw conclusions and then you formulate recommendations for the future. You can go to a thesis. Let's take an example. Let's say at the end of this hepatitis B study, we realize that among these hepatitis B positive women, the majority of them were pregnant women above who had more than 3 children. That is multiparous women, but more than 3 children. Now, at the end of that thesis, you can conclude that from your work, probably being a multiparous woman predisposes you to have hepatitis B. That is hypothetically. And at the end of your work, you would draw that conclusion and formulate a recommendation. A next student who picks this up sees this and then asks himself, okay, is there truly an association or is there truly a link between the number of children or the number of times you've given birth and the contraction of hepatitis B virus? And that can lead to another thesis or another topic for your research study. Now, some people do it very easily. They just particularly love a specialty. Maybe they fell in love with a particular specialty during their posting and they want to do work in that specialty. Most of the times with this approach, the next step after identifying the specialty where you want to do your work will be to look for a supervisor who is going to guide you for the topic in that field. And this brings us actually to our second point, which is the choice of a supervisor or co-supervisor. Now, I would like to stress here that this is not necessarily a second step. It could be a first step. Some people actually start by choosing a supervisor first before then going to choose a topic together with the supervisor. So the first and the second step are interchangeable. One can go before the other. And several students have several reasons for choosing a particular supervisor or another one. Some because of maybe personal affinity that they have with this professor or with this doctor. Some probably because of the research profile of the supervisor. Some maybe because of the notoriety of the supervisor in the school or in the scientific community. There are several reasons, but whatever the reason that pushes one to choose a supervisor, I would like to give you guys a few tips on things you should not forget or things you should consider when you're choosing your supervisor. Very important. Whether you're choosing a supervisor before your topic or you're choosing a supervisor after having had a topic, it's good to have these points in mind. The first, which for me personally is the most important, is the availability of the supervisor. We know most of our professors are very busy people. A professor can run a whole department in the hospital, at the same time run a whole department in the faculty of medicine, and at the same time have maybe a private clinic and so on. They are very busy. And it's important for you to know whether this supervisor is able to give you some of his time to actually follow you properly throughout your thesis. This is very important. There have been very unfortunate or unpleasant experiences of students who get totally abandoned by their supervisors and have to do the work all alone, and the supervisor only comes or shows up at the end of the thesis. Make sure you know the availability of your supervisor before choosing him. And it's very easy to do so by simply talking with your senior students, those who defended before you, or those who worked with these supervisors before, to have an idea of how available that supervisor is. The next is the field of expertise. Of course, you will not carry out a study in gynecology and then you choose a supervisor who is an orthopedic surgeon. That doesn't make sense. Ideally, your supervisor should be somebody who is an expert in the field related to the study you're about to carry out. The next, which is very, very important, is knowledge and skills in research for this supervisor. I want you all to know that a great clinician is not equal to a great researcher. I have had this phrase in my mind for the past 4 years because I was told the same thing by our moderator, Dr. Walford, when I was a student. And I think it's very true. Not all great clinicians are great researchers. We have many who are good clinicians and good researchers, but I bet you there are some very good clinicians amongst our professors who are not as good in the field of research. This is very important. To try to make a distinction between both and make sure that the supervisor you're choosing can properly guide you not only in his field of expertise, but also guide you through the research process. Also, it's good to know the mentoring techniques and the coaching methods that the supervisor uses. I know there are some of you who intend to actually cruise through your 7th year. I remember some students who say they don't want any stress. All they want is a very simple study that's going to take them a few months, they graduate and they are done with it. They don't need stress in their life. That could be what you want. In this case, make sure that before choosing your supervisor, it's a supervisor who will demand so much out of you. Because mind you, there are some supervisors who will actually ask the 7th year medical student to come and be doing internship in the hospital while recruiting and while doing his thesis. Or will ask of you to be doing consultations frequently with him, or will need to be seeing you every week or every 2 or 3 days for an update on your work. With such supervisors, if you have ulterior motive or ulterior responsibilities in your 7th year, it might be difficult to juggle it too. So keep this in mind. Also, for those who are interested in very high marks, personally, I don't think that's the most important point of the thesis, but then it counts a lot to many of you. Make sure you find out how previous students who work with the supervisors fared in their thesis. It's very important. Generally, if there's a supervisor whom every year students always have A grade, A plus grade, I mean, logically, you should guess that if you work with a supervisor, you should probably have a similar mark if you work hard enough. So finding out from these previous students might also help to have this idea. And on this second step, I want to end with the choice of co-supervisors. Sometimes people neglect the choice of these co-supervisors, and I think that is a big mistake. In some cases, you might not have the choice. Your supervisor dictates or tells you what co-supervisors you're going to work with. That is okay. You can't do much about it. But in a case where it's flexible, where you have that possibility for you to choose who are co-supervisors, choose them very wisely. Ideally, in many cases, the supervisor himself, who usually is a professor, is so busy that most of your research work is being done with the mentorship of your co-supervisor, which implies that this co-supervisor needs to be an expert in the field, but equally research savvy, because if he doesn't have the basic research skills, he will not be able to guide you properly through this research process. And this is even more important for the students, for example, in the Faculty of Health Science, Boya, where actually by tradition, most often it is the co-supervisor who acts as your rapporteur during your thesis and not your supervisor, which means that while choosing this co-supervisor, you should bear in mind that that could be the person seated that day in front of the jury with the task or with the very important task of defending you. So keep all of this in mind when you're choosing your supervisor. That said, if you've had a supervisor and you've had a research topic, the very next step is the elaboration of a research proposal or research protocol. Now, some might ask, I know a few of you might not know what a research protocol is. I mean, I myself, until I got into the research proper, I've never heard the word research protocol, honestly. So the first day my supervisor told me about go and make a protocol, I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what he was talking about. So to just give you a brief and general idea, a research protocol is like a structured formal document that helps explain exactly what you're going to do with your research throughout your research. In other words, it's a document where you explain systematically and in detail exactly what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it for your research. So it's just like a guideline. It's like a roadmap. It's like a roadmap to a particular destination, telling the reader or yourself that I'm going to start from here. Next, I will do this. This is how I will do this at this particular time, and so on till the end. Simply put, that is what a research protocol is. And for most first timers, those who are just starting research, it's usually a very difficult task for the first time. But once you've done one research proposal, subsequent ones become a lot more easy. One thing I want to stress here is about you assessing the feasibility of your study. I'm sure Dr. Wafe is going to present when he's going to be talking about research question and objectives. He's going to stress a lot on how to formulate a research topic. And one of the points we're going to mention is this feasibility. But I want to talk about this here again because a lot of students make mistakes which they can't back out of later on because they didn't know this from the start. One aspect of feasibility I actually want to stress on is that of the sample size. Most students draft their research protocol, they might even calculate a minimum sample size needed for their study, and they don't assess their study site to make sure that they'll be able to attain that required sample size when they are doing their study. And most of the time, this ends up putting them in a situation where they may be obliged to change their topic or end up doing a study with a very much lower sample size than that which is required. This is very important. Good example is you need to carry out a study. You know that your sample size minimum needed for this study is, let's say, 150 participants. Then you intend to recruit, let's say, in Hopital Central. If you go to Hopital Central and you look at the participants that you need to work with, and you look at the usual frequency at which patients with this particular pathology frequent the hospital, maybe in 3-4 months' time, I'll be able to have just about 50 patients. In that case, it means it's a problem. You should either adjust your topic early enough, or if you think about maybe adding other sites for recruitment to make sure that you can attain the sample size. This is very important. I've had many students redo a thesis, change the topic midway through the thesis, just because they didn't assess the feasibility. And when they started their recruitment, they realized that it was possible for them to go to the end. So it's very important to do this. So in the protocol, there are many steps in the research protocol. These steps are going to know them. I'm going to know these steps as time goes by. I'm not going to stress a lot on that. The one thing I want to put an accent on is the literature review. This is very important. Most of the times, students don't give a lot of importance while doing this particular point in the literature review. First of all, what's the literature review? Before you carry out a study, you need to go and search in books, on the internet, in past studies, all what is known on the topic you are going to research on. That is very important. You read through textbooks, you read past research studies, all what that specialty or all what that topic is all about. That is what they call literature review. And why I'm stressing about this is that the better you do your literature review from the start, the easier your work is going to be down the road, particularly in the step where you're going to do what they call discussion. Because the literature review that you're doing now, or the studies that you're going to be getting as you're going through the internet, are going to serve right now in your protocol, but also later on in your discussion of results after you must have done the analysis of your data. So make sure you do a proper literature review from the start and not keep it for the end when you're supposed to be doing your discussion. Now, one thing I want to see also about the proposal is that a research protocol, we are never really done with our research protocol. It's a continuous process. Meaning your faculty might give you a deadline, say by 25th of December, all of you must hand in a protocol. Once you've handed your protocol, it doesn't mean your protocol is done. No. You keep working on that protocol. A protocol is a document on which you will keep working from now up to the day you're going to defend. In other words, this research protocol actually is going to be your thesis later on. You're just going to change a few things and add a few chapters, and your research protocol will become your thesis. So it means if you work very hard, very meticulously, and produce a very great protocol from the start, you're going to have less work at the end while finalizing your thesis. So put in your effort right now, burn the midnight candle, and then provide a great protocol to ease your work down the line. That is for the third step. Now, concerning this fourth step, actually, this fourth step, which is elaboration, validation, and pretest of data collection tool, this is actually an integral part of your protocol. But I decided to put this on a step of its own because of how important this part is. It is a very, very key step in your thesis process. Now, what is a data collection tool? All of you, when you do research, actually, you're going to go out and collect information either from participants or from registers or from books. All of the information you're collecting to use in your research is what they call data. And you don't collect this information anyhow. You need a particular tool to help you gather this information. A very common word used is what they call a questionnaire. That's another word for this. A questionnaire is needed in almost every study that you do. Whatsoever studies you do, you have data to collect, and you need to collect the data with a particular tool. Now, how do you come about designing this tool? Generally, you design a proper data collection tool using the background knowledge you have on the topic, using past studies that have been done on this topic and the data that is collected in these past studies. And most importantly, using the input from your supervisors. Your supervisors are the experts in these fields. Therefore, they are the people best placed to know whether your tool is not only adequate, but complete and adequate to carry out the task ahead of you, which is their research study. So once you design your data collection tool, the next step for you is always to meet your supervisor who is going to give input or make sure that all the questions found there are necessary for your thesis and that all questions necessary for your thesis are actually found on your data collection tool. Your supervisors are best placed to help you with that. Then after this, the most important thing never to forget. I mean, I think if there is one thing I would like everyone to retain from my presentation, will be this point. Do not start collecting your data or start recruiting patients without meeting a statistician or a data analysis savvy person to validate that questionnaire. If this is the only thing that you retain from my presentation, I'll be happy because this is very important. I cannot stress enough on this part. If you should go home with one message from Dr. Leofozu today, keep in mind that once I must have designed my data collection tool and it gets approved by my supervisor. If this supervisor is not a statistician or is not very good at data analysis, I should make sure that I consult a statistician or a medical doctor who is savvy in data analysis, preferably data analysis in medical studies, for him to validate my questionnaire. Because there are particular ways of asking particular questions to make sure that the data that you collect at the end can be used properly and can give the results expected from the data. If you miss this step, you are in for trouble. So please, let's not forget this particular point. Now, once they have validated your data, you have to know that if your data is not great, what to follow later on won't be great. There's this very famous statement, garbage in, garbage out. What does this mean? It means if you have a poor data collection tool and you collect data poorly, don't expect to have good results. That's simply what it means. If you pour garbage into the system can only give you garbage as results. And then after validating your data entry tool, the next step for you now will be to do a pretest of your data collection tool. What is a pretest? It's actually going out to do recruitment, to recruit a few number of participants, 10, 15, 20, who normally will not be part of your end sample size. The aim of this pretest or early recruitment is for you to make sure that the tool you've designed is actually adequate for data collection and to help you add or subtract a few things to make your data collection tool perfect. Most students usually bypass this step, but I think it's very important. If you have the time and the opportunity to pre-test your data collection tool before you collect your data properly, please make sure you do this. Then, of course, once your data collection tool is properly designed and you've pre-tested the data collection tool and adjusted it adequately, the next step will be for you to go for the data collection proper, or in other words, to recruit your participants. Often this step is the step that takes the longest amount of time. Averagely, for an average study with an average sample size of, let's say, 200 to 250, it could take about 1 month to 3 months. Some people take longer, some take a shorter amount of time, but from experience, averagely, this particular step takes the longest amount of time. Now, while collecting your data, please make sure that you are very meticulous, because another way of getting garbage in, which will of course produce garbage out, is by you collecting data poorly. A proper tool used poorly can only give you poor data. I hope you understand this. So you have to be very meticulous when you're collecting your data and avoid the main source of bias which you can have during data collection, like measurement bias, selection bias, and so on. As time goes by, you're going to know more about these terms. So you have to make sure that you collect your data meticulously and you do it properly to avoid using a correct tool poorly. And students often have difficulties attaining their sample sizes. It's a very common problem with students. During the thesis, they plan to have a certain number, but then as they are recruiting, they realize that they can't get as many as large a sample size as they needed to. One advice I want to give here is that if you are in such a situation, please do not yield to temptation. Don't fraud. What do I mean by fraud? I have a few students over the past years who usually at this step, once they realize they can't attain their minimum sample size and they fear the wrath of their supervisor, they go about creating data, creating fictitious participants, or the worst case scenario, even doing duplication of data. That is, you see somebody who needs 100 participants, he has recruited just maybe 60, and he decides to take 40 out of the 60 and duplicate their data into his database to make 105 participants. Please don't do this, because you will not only be collecting poor data, which will give a wrong or poor reflection of your sample size. But you have to know that the statistician who is going to analyze your data can actually figure this out. So I would advise all of us to make sure that we prepare for our study well ahead of time, assess the feasibility properly ahead of time to avoid this kind of issues and to avoid the temptation of carrying out fraud during the thesis. And then one last point about data collection, which usually is underlooked by most students, but which should be very important if we want to make sure that we carry out proper research following the norms, is to always keep ethical considerations in mind. Ethics. In all research concerning human beings, there are certain codes or certain rules that you must always have in mind. Top of my head, a good example is the rule of doing no harm. You have to make sure that whatsoever you're doing to this participant does not cause him harm, for example. That's just one of them. At this level, I'll invite all of you to look at what they call the Helsinki Declaration. This declaration summarizes all of these considerations to have concerning ethics while doing research with human beings or doing biomedical research. Now, once you've collected your data, assuming and hopefully properly collected data, the next step will be for you to enter your data and to analyze it. Data entry and analysis. Well, actually, these are kind of two steps, but very linked. I group them into one because they are done simultaneously, but actually they are two separate steps. Or in this case, I can call them two sub-steps. Now, what's data entry? When you collect your data or when you recruit your patients, generally what you have is information collected on a piece of paper. That is, you take a piece of paper where you've printed all your questions, you go and meet a participant, you ask questions, when he gives you answers, you jot on the paper. At the end of the day, you have a whole pile of papers with information collected from participants. Now, you cannot analyze that data in that state. You use a computer to analyze them. So you need a means to convert that hard copy data into soft copy. That is what we call data entry. Simply converting your data, which is found on pieces of paper or hard copy, into soft copy or transferring them into a computer. And you should know that there are various tools that they use or which are appropriate for this particular process. As time goes by, you'll have more, you'll be elated further on what tools are appropriate for this data entry and which are not. Now, one thing I always advise you to do before you enter your data is to do visual verification. Sometimes this helps a lot. That is, before actually keying in your data, take the paper and then look through it visually. Sometimes there are very obvious errors which you can correct directly before you do your data entry. Remember, all of these steps, we have to be meticulous, because if at any one of these steps we do something wrongly, what we'll be inserting in is what? Garbage. And of course, if you're inserting garbage in, you should expect garbage as a result. So this data entry is done using what they call usually a data entry application. It's actually an application which is designed to look like your questionnaire for you to enter data. For the French speaking, it's what they call un masque de saisie. So after you've collected your data, you would need this application for you to enter your data into a software or into your computer. Averagely, this step takes a few days. Why am I giving the duration of this? Usually, what most students like to do is they want to be entering your data as they are recruiting. That is, if this week I recruit 20 participants, they want to enter those 20 immediately. They believe that's going to help them save time. But then I think when you weigh the pro and the cons of this method, the cons are outweigh. What I'll advise you to do is recruit your data right up to about the last week or the last 2 weeks. Then you can start entering your data. Why? Because during the early weeks of data collection, even if you've pre-tested your questionnaire, more often than not, there's at least one or two things that you're going to modify on this data entry tool. And the way most of these data entry applications or MassQDCZ are designed, they are designed such that once you started entering data, if you modify a particular question on this this tool, is going to disrupt all of the data you've already entered. So my advice would be that when you reach at this step, be collecting your data towards the last 2 weeks or last week of your data collection. Then you can start your data entry. For a student who is really driven and who is committed and hardworking, it doesn't take more than a few days to enter all your data for an average sample size. So advisable for you to enter the data at the end of your recruitment. Now, of course, if you enter your data and your data is now soft copy in a laptop, what you need to do next is to analyze the data. Um, if someone was to ask what is data analysis, let me give this practical example. Let's say you had a study probably on pregnant women and you recruited 30 pregnant women for the scene. And among these 30 pregnant women, of course, they have various ages, from 20, from 25, from 26, and so on. Now, when you gather this data, for you to present us your work or the result of your work, we agree that it will be quite stupid, excuse the term, for you to come and start saying, okay, participant A, whose name is this, had this age, participant B, whose name is this, had this age, and so on. That's not only stupid, but it's very cumbersome to do that. Which is why you need to find a way of giving us all the information you've collected in a summarized and very comprehensive manner. Taking the same example of the age, rather than you giving each of the ages of the participants, it will be easier and better for you to give the mean age of your population. Rather than you telling us how many of these women had 3 children, how many had 2 children, how many had no children, it will be easier or to tell us that this woman had 3 children, this had two, this had two and zero. It will be better for you to tell us that out of the 30 we recruited, 5 had no children, 10 had maybe 5 children, 5 had 3 children, and so on. And not only give the number, but equally give us the proportion that this number occupies in your total sample, meaning the number and the percentages. So in simple terms, that is what they call data analysis, a way for you to summarize. Actually, like I said earlier, this data entry and data analysis, you can do that yourself. That is, you, the student or the final year student, you are capable of performing this yourself. But then it takes a lot of commitment. It takes a student who is very driven and committed to make sure that you learn what is necessary and be able to apply it, because two main things are necessary for you to be able to analyze your data. First, you need the basic statistical knowledge. Of course, this knowledge you can have it from books, from self-learning. For most of us, we had some of these lessons in the first cycle in biostatistics and all the like, and we might have forgotten most of it by now. So I advise all of us to go back to those notes, because you need those basic knowledge in statistics and research methodology. But in addition to this, you also need to have some skills in the manipulation of software necessary for data analysis. So all of this is true, is very technical and can be a little bit tough, but it's possible for every student to learn how to do this and do it on your own. The proof is most of us had to do this analysis on our own, and then we carried out our thesis successfully. And this last point, Dr. Ngwina already emphasized on it. I'm still going to say it. Data analysis or statistical analysis does not correct poorly collected data. We keep on stressing on this and stressing because it's very important. If you collect your data poorly, don't expect a statistician to perform some magic to correct it or to fix it. No. What you collect or what you put into the software or into the machine is what you're getting. If you put in garbage, you're going to get garbage out of it. So, of course, once you've done your data analysis, next you need to, of course, at the end of the analysis, what you have now are results. You analyze your data and you come out with results, and then you need to interpret and discuss these results. So this is the 7th step in our list. And like I said earlier, for data analysis, you need some background knowledge on statistics for analysis, but equally for the interpretation of your results. What do I mean by interpretation of results? At the end, when you have these results, you need to make a few comments about them. And for you to make proper comment or a proper interpretation of the results you have, either results you got by analyzing yourself or results you got from a statistician, For you to make a proper interpretation, you need to have some basic knowledge in statistics to understand these results. If you don't have this basic knowledge in statistics, it will be complicated for you to understand the results. And if you can't understand the results properly, of course, you can't do proper commenting or interpretation of these results. So I'll be sending all of you back to your first cycle notes, go back to your research methodology notes, go back to your biostatistics notes. Those are going to be important, trust me. And for those of you who have completely forgotten, you can do some self-learning. And of course, you're going to be having a lot of people offering mentorship, ourselves included, to help you gain these basic skills. Now, after interpretation of your results comes what they call discussion. Well, if I was to put it in a simple term, discussion is like telling the audience why this particular result was this way. Why in your own study population, your results follow this particular track. Generally, this is done in comparison to other studies. Let's say you do a study on the prevalence of hepatitis B amongst pregnant women, and you have a very high prevalence, like double what we know in Cameroon. You need now to tell us with the use of other results in your study, with the use of other characteristics in your study population, try to explain why your own prevalence in your study population was that high. And you do that equally in comparison to what other studies have done before. That is what they call discussion. Usually for young researchers, and unfortunately myself included, this is still considered the most difficult part of the thesis. I mean, I've done a good number of them, but personally, it's still what I consider the most difficult part of my research or of a research process. But what you should know is that there's no squared, strict way of doing a discussion. An approach to discussion is a lot more subjective, and the skill of discussion comes with time. The more you discuss results, the better you get at it. So for the first try, believe me, be ready for it. You're going to make a lot of blunders, but the more you discuss, the better you're going to get at it. And fortunately for you, you'll be having supervisors ready to guide you through this process. Well, once you've had your results, you've interpreted them, you've discussed them, you're almost done with the work, with the thesis. The next step is the drafting of your final thesis. Remember, on step 3, I was talking about your proposal, and I said, do your best with this proposal because it's going to end up being your final thesis. Well, that's the case. At this level, you need to add a few parts, a few sections of your thesis that are left, like drawing a conclusion. You draw some conclusions based on the results you have. From these conclusions, you formulate recommendations, you make an abstract, you correct your list of references, and after adding all these extra parts to your work, you're actually adding them to what was previously your protocol. You don't get into your protocol and you do a few or a little editing. Mostly what you do with the protocol will be changing the language, because in the protocol you are talking in the future tense. I will, we shall, we are going to. That's the language you use in your protocol. But once you're done with your thesis and you've added all the other sections, you need to change all of this language throughout the protocol into past tense. We did. So if your protocol was properly done, you gave enough time and meticulous attention to your protocol from the start, definitely at this stage of drafting your final thesis, you're going to have it a lot easier. So don't forget this. Working hard on your protocol is very important. Also, you need to have some basic skills in MS Word. Of course, we are drafting a document using Word for the majority of you. And there are some few skills you need to do a proper editing for your document to look pleasurable, for your document to look professional, for it to look nice, like Dr. Vina just said. For you to have a document which reflects a proper researcher, you need to do a few editing, and some skills in Microsoft Word will be needed for this. So bear in at the back of your mind that it will be good for you to gain some skills in manipulation of Microsoft Word. Also, once you're done with this, don't keep it for yourself. Share it around. Have your friends, your family members, your father, your mom, even those who don't know anything about medicine. Have them go through your thesis and read through for simple grammatical errors. These help a lot. At times, you might read through 15, 20 times, you don't see errors, but someone else with a completely set of eyes, a fresh set of eyes, sees things that you missed. It's very important to think about sharing it around for people to read through and bring some modifications. Then, once this is done, you get to this next step, which is the conception of your PowerPoint and pre-defense. Actually, I think Dr. Ngina has spoken well enough completely about PowerPoint, so I won't label the point anymore. There are a number of rules to follow when you're doing a PowerPoint. So you have to make sure that you know these rules and that you follow them. Like he said, a good thesis. You did a great protocol. You had an amazing topic. It was very great. It was interesting. You did a proper tool. You collected your data ideally. You did a perfect analysis. You had great results. You discussed them very well. Your final write-up was amazing. But then on the D day, you present a very crappy PowerPoint in front of a jury. Believe me, you're going to earn a poor mark. So, like I said, a very good plate of food served on a very crappy table loses all its value. So make sure your PowerPoint is up to standards. And one thing I would like to advise you guys is to do as many pre-defense or defense simulations as possible. Sometimes some people are lazy with this step. Believe me, it makes a remarkable amount of difference. The more you present in front of people, the more you get used to your presentation, and the more you build the confidence to do a presentation worthy of a proper researcher. So make sure you do as many pre-defense and as many simulations as possible so that you'll be very ready for the D-Day. And also, this pre-defense helps you anticipate some questions. I personally, I think about 50% of the questions I actually have during my proper defense, I've had them during my defense simulations. So it helps you a lot. But some might say that's sort of cheating because you're preparing answers before time. But that all enters in the package of preparation. It helps you to prepare to have the confidence to do a proper presentation on the D-Day. So don't hesitate to practice and practice and practice. Don't relent on that. Well, you've gone through the first step, second, third, fourth, right up to the eighth and the ninth step. Everything is done. You have your PowerPoint. You have practiced. You've done a lot of pre-defense. You've amassed all the confidence you need. Now is the D-Day. You've worked hard for months, probably 6 months, 7 months, 8 months of hard work, of frustration, of toiling. Finally, after all this hard work, you are ready. So all is left for you to do. Go ahead, ace your defense, and make yourself and your family and your friends proud. With that said, I would like to thank you all for your attention.